Buffalo, New York, 1842. Joseph Dart stands on the muddy banks of the Buffalo River, watching Irish laborers haul grain sack by sack from a ship's hold. The work is backbreaking, the pace agonizing. A single vessel takes nearly a week to unload. Merchants mock his grand scheme. "Dart, I'm sorry for you," one dealer sneers. "It won't do. Remember what I say. Irishmen's backs are the cheapest elevators ever built." But Dart sees something the skeptics cannot. He envisions a machine that will revolutionize how grain moves from farm to market. A steam-powered colossus that will transform Buffalo from a muddy frontier outpost into the greatest grain port the world has ever known. His invention will spread across oceans, reshaping commerce from Liverpool to Odessa. The principles he establishes will become the invisible infrastructure of agricultural prosperity, so fundamental that nations will forget they exist until they desperately need them. A century and a half later, Soviet leaders would discover exactly what happens when a superpower ignores the lessons Joseph Dart taught the world. The communist system that had sent men into space and built nuclear arsenals could not solve a problem that a Connecticut hat merchant had cracked in 1842. The result was one of the Cold War's humiliating reversals. The Soviet Union, ruler of the world's most fertile farmland, forced to beg its ideological enemy for grain. The technology they lacked wasn't secret. It wasn't sophisticated. It was simply the accumulated wisdom of how to move grain from field to table without losing it along the way. The Erie Canal changed everything. When the Great Waterway opened in 1825, it created an unbroken liquid highway from the Atlantic Ocean to the heart of the American frontier. Buffalo sat at the western terminus, perfectly positioned to receive the wheat pouring out of Ohio and Indiana. By the late 1830s, grain ships were arriving faster than the port could handle them. The harbor became a bottleneck. Vessels stacked up for days, waiting their turn to unload. The problem wasn't the canal, it was the technology, or rather, the complete absence of it. Grain moved the same way it had for centuries. Teams of Irish immigrants descended into ship holds, shoveling wheat into barrels, hoisting them by rope and muscle onto the dock. A single vessel could take a week to empty. The system was medieval, back-breaking, and hopelessly inadequate for the flood of grain that modern transportation had unleashed. Joseph Dart watched this chaos and saw opportunity. He remembered reading about Oliver Evans, a Philadelphia inventor who had built automated flour mills in the 1780s using steam-powered bucket conveyors to move grain vertically through his facilities. Evans had solved the problem of moving grain inside a mill. Dart realized the same principle could revolutionize moving grain between ships and storage. He partnered with Robert Dunbar, a Scottish mechanical engineer with a reputation for practical brilliance. Together, they designed something the world had never seen, a steam-powered grain elevator with a marine leg that could descend directly into a ship's hold. Buckets attached to a continuous leather belt would scoop grain from below and carry it upward into massive storage bins. The structure rose 50 feet above the Buffalo River, a wooden colossus at the junction of the Evans Ship Canal. On June 12, 1843, the schooner Philadelphia moored beneath the Dart elevator. The marine leg descended into the hold. Steam hissed through pipes. The bucket chain began its endless rotation. By nightfall, the ship was empty. One day had accomplished what once required a week. The skeptics fell silent. Within 4 years, 9 more elevators lined Buffalo's waterfront. Dunbar's reputation spread across continents. Commissions arrived from Liverpool, from Hull, from Odessa on the Black Sea. By the Civil War's end, Buffalo boasted 26 elevators and had surpassed London, Rotterdam, and even Odessa itself to become the largest grain port on Earth. The technology that critics dismissed as folly had transformed global commerce. Joseph Dart had given the world a gift he refused to patent, preferring that his simple apparatus belong to all humanity. The grain elevator was never just a machine. It was the foundation of an entirely new system, one that transformed agriculture from local sustenance into global commodity. Before Dart's invention, grain traveled in sacks and barrels, handled piece by piece, vulnerable to weather and theft and spoilage at every transfer point. After it, grain flowed like liquid through an integrated network of storage, transportation, and exchange that made possible the feeding of industrial cities thousands of miles from the nearest wheat field. Buffalo proved what the system could accomplish. By 1887, 43 grain elevators crowded the waterfront, their combined value reaching $8 million. Together, they could transfer 4 million bushels in a single day. Ships arrived from Duluth and Chicago, their holds heavy with prairie wheat. Within hours, that grain had been weighed, graded, stored, and prepared for transfer to canal boats bound for New York or rail cars headed to flour mills across the Northeast. The city had become a processing node in a continental machine. But the technology's true significance lay in what it enabled beyond Buffalo. Robert Dunbar's designs traveled across oceans. Liverpool adopted the American system to handle grain arriving from around the world. Hull followed, and most ironically, so did Odessa, the great Black Sea port that had dominated European grain commerce for generations. Russian merchants recognized genius when they saw it. They imported Buffalo's technology to move Ukrainian wheat more efficiently to Mediterranean markets. This was the invisible infrastructure of agricultural prosperity. When the system functioned properly, no one noticed it existed. Grain moved from Kansas farms to London bakeries through an unbroken chain of elevators, rail cars, ships, and warehouses, each link optimized over decades of incremental improvement. The efficiency became so routine that people forgot it required any effort at all. They assumed bread simply appeared in shops, conjured from some inexhaustible source. What the West built through a century of market-driven refinement was more than machinery. It was accumulated knowledge embedded in physical form. Every elevator incorporated lessons learned from fires, collapses, and bottlenecks. Every rail spur reflected calculations about optimal grain flow. Every warehouse embodied decisions about moisture control, pest prevention, and inventory management. The system contained intelligence that no blueprint could capture, wisdom that existed only in the relationships between farmers, merchants, railroads, and millers who had spent generations learning how to move grain without losing it along the way. Nations that inherited fertile soil, but not these systems, would eventually discover what that absence cost. The Soviet Union inherited the richest agricultural land on Earth. The Chernozem belt stretched from Ukraine through southern Russia, black soil so fertile that farmers called it nature's gift to humanity. Under the Tsars, this land had fed Europe. Odessa flourished as the empire's second greatest port, its warehouses bursting with wheat bound for Mediterranean markets. Russia was a grain exporter, a breadbasket, a nation that understood its soil was its greatest treasure. Then came the revolution. Collectivization shattered the agricultural system that centuries had built. Stalin's planners seized farms, executed kulaks, and forced peasants onto collective enterprises where individual initiative meant nothing and production quotas meant everything. The ideology prioritized heavy industry above all else. Factories were glorious. Tractors were symbols of progress. Grain elevators and storage facilities were mundane infrastructure unworthy of revolutionary attention. The consequences accumulated invisible at first. Organizational chaos plagued distribution networks. Ideological rigidity prevented adaptation. Climatological disasters struck with predictable regularity. But the system had no resilience to absorb them. CIA analysts studying Soviet agriculture documented the dysfunction with clinical precision. Inadequate storage caused huge losses of nutrients. Wastage of fertilizer ran heavy at railroad sidings. Government experts inside the Soviet Union itself estimated that eliminating spoilage could increase grain availability by 25%. A quarter of the harvest was vanishing between field and table. The 1963 drought exposed the rot. Grain production plummeted from 134 million tons to barely 107 million. Bread lines formed in Soviet cities, a fact initially hidden from Khrushchev himself. When he learned the truth, he faced an impossible choice. The nation that had launched Sputnik, that had built hydrogen bombs, that had declared itself the vanguard of human progress, could not feed its own people. Khrushchev exhausted the country's hard currency reserves and spent part of its gold stockpile purchasing grain from the capitalist West. The psychology of central planning had created this disaster. Moscow measured success by production targets, not delivery efficiency. Factories that built combines received medals. Warehouses that prevented spoilage received nothing. Ships waited 5 weeks to unload at congested ports because nobody had invested in dock infrastructure. Grain rotted on railway sidings because distribution systems operated according to 5-year plans rather than harvest schedules. The command economy could mobilize millions to build dams and launch rockets. It could not master the humble art of moving wheat from farm to mouth without losing it along the way. By the early 1970s, Soviet agricultural failures had reached crisis proportions. Decades of underinvestment in infrastructure, combined with the inherent inefficiencies of central planning, left the system perpetually on the edge of collapse. Then came the summer of 1972. An extreme drought scorched the Soviet heartland, devastating crops across the Black Earth Belt. The harvest that planners had counted on simply vanished under relentless sun. Soviet negotiators moved with uncharacteristic speed and unprecedented secrecy. In June 1972, 2 teams arrived at the Madison Hotel in Washington. Foreign Trade Minister Nikolai Patolichev led one delegation. Nikolai Belousov commanded the other. Their mission was simple: purchase as much American grain as possible before anyone realized what was happening. Across the table sat representatives from Continental Grain, Cargill, and other American trading houses, along with government officials who had no idea they were about to be outmaneuvered. The Soviets bought 19 million metric tons of grain. 1/4 of the entire American wheat harvest disappeared into communist holds. They exceeded their $750 million credit limit in a single month, spending over $1 billion before September arrived. American negotiators, convinced the purchases were merely for livestock feed, subsidized the transactions with $300 million in public funds. Nobody in Washington understood that global grain stocks had collapsed alongside the Soviet harvest. When the truth emerged, Americans dubbed it the Great Grain Robbery. Senator Henry Jackson coined the phrase, comparing the Soviet deception to the infamous 1963 train heist. Global food prices surged 30 to 50%. Grain stockpiles that had taken years to accumulate evaporated almost overnight. The deal that was supposed to ease Cold War tensions had instead triggered an international food crisis. But 1972 was merely prologue. The 1975 harvest proved even more catastrophic, falling 76 million tons short of targets, the worst failure since 1965. Ships stacked up at Soviet ports, waiting 5 weeks to unload because the infrastructure to receive them simply did not exist. Grain that had crossed oceans rotted on docks within sight of hungry cities. The nation that controlled the world's most fertile farmland could not move wheat from port to population. The ultimate irony required no elaboration. The Soviet Union had launched satellites, split atoms, and challenged American supremacy across the globe. Yet it depended on Iowa farmers and Kansas wheat to feed its people. The system Joseph Dart invented in 1842 was now sustaining the workers' paradise. The Great Grain Robbery revealed a truth that Joseph Dart understood in 1842, but Soviet planners never grasped. Agriculture is not just about growing crops. It is about moving them, storing them, protecting them from spoilage, and delivering them to people who need them. The Soviets could plant wheat in the richest soil on Earth, but without the invisible systems that American commerce had spent a century perfecting, that wheat would rot before it reached a single table. Dart's grain elevator was not complicated. It was, as he described it, a simple apparatus. But simple does not mean unimportant. The steam-powered bucket conveyor that the skeptics mocked became the foundation of global agricultural commerce. The principles established on the Buffalo River spread to Liverpool, to Odessa, to every major grain port in the world. They created the infrastructure that allowed nations to feed their people. The Soviet Union built nuclear weapons, launched satellites, and competed with America in every arena of technological achievement. But they never mastered the humble art of grain handling that a Connecticut hat merchant had pioneered over a century before. In the end, the workers' paradise had to purchase its bread from the capitalists. The superpower that controlled the world's greatest farmland had to import grain from Iowa. There's a lesson in this story that transcends the Cold War. Nations rise and fall not just on what they produce, but on the invisible systems that move production to consumption. Joseph Dart understood this. The Soviets learned it the hard way, and the Irish backs that skeptics called the cheapest elevators ever built proved to be the most expensive mistake of all.